I'll go with not. Let me begin in the name of our Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer. And also by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We pray for God's grace, love and justice to continue in this land. I couldn't help but pick up on a bit of a theme running through our Bible readings today. I know you're not meant to just pick verses out, but I did. Isaiah 6:8 says, "Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here I am, send me.'" Luke 5:11, "When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him." 1 Corinthians 15:1, "Now I remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which you also stand." It seems there's a bit of a discipleship proclamation theme here. And I wanted to start off with a fun but also potentially very daunting exercise for some, and it's an opt-in. Don't feel like you have to do this. But I wanted everyone to think about a one short sentence explanation of the gospel. If that's a bit daunting, maybe think of one word that you would use to summarise the gospel. And if you feel comfortable, share that with the person next to you just for a moment. So one sentence or one word, and then if you really don't feel comfortable, then just listen. So, yeah. Oh, what was yours? How are we all going? I wanted to see a show of hands who had very similar explanations, summaries? Who had very different summaries? And who kind of had in the middle? All right, not everyone participated there, but I think we'll get it, like no one had their hand up for that we had the exact same explanation, which is kind of the thing I was hoping would come out of this. Let me ask you, would you use different words or a different summary if you were speaking to some of our children in our congregation? How about sharing the gospel with someone who speaks a different language to you? What about someone like my eldest sister, who has a cognitive disability and could probably on a good day repeat the words back to you that I love Jesus. But if you asked her to profess what she believes, you probably wouldn't get a consistent answer. You could likely get a very unrelated answer, and you may not get any answer at all. So we obviously have frameworks and systems through which we understand the world. And language is a very big one for us. We've been discussing this in our philosophy groups, one of which was last week. Our culture and our experiences inform our understanding and meaning of the world. So there's very much the framework through which Western society works, which we want to logically explain everything. We want to have concise control over what's going on and be able to rationalise it. We don't have much space for the unknown, and if we do, it's likely a future something which we'll at some point soon discover and eventually we'll understand it and be able to explain it to the T. So therefore, in Western Christianity, we often talk in doctrinal truths. The way that we share our faith can sometimes be a set of propositions that people can either subscribe to or not. And we share a choice with them. You know, you can tick this list or you don't need to. In my studies last semester, I sat in a 4-day class. It was very powerful, learning about Indigenous theologies, learning how, how many Indigenous peoples understand the Bible and God and Jesus. Sounds like Sunday school. I heard story after story of how Western Christians claim to bring God to the lands we now call Canada, America and Australia. They ignored the worship of God that already existed and imposed a particular understanding of God and a particular expression of faith onto these people. They banned important cultural traditions. One story I remember was from a native North American people, the Mi'kmaq people, and they celebrate the start of spring through a dance ritual that imitates a snake, shedding its skin and embracing new life. So they would move forward as a pair and then peel around, and that would kind of go on for a little bit. And it was used to give thanks to the Creator for the life of, that would come during this next season of spring. Because it involved imitating a snake, in the snake, we see the snake in the Bible in Genesis representing the devil. So this cultural tradition was banned because it was perceived to be a ritual of worshipping the devil. We know now that Indigenous peoples across the world were actually robbed of the gospel. A lot of them, some weren't. They were robbed of engaging with Jesus directly. Instead, they were given this very Western Christian framework. And without seeming to suggest that I understand this exact experience, because these actions are still devastating our Indigenous populations, and I cannot fully identify in any way with that. But I can in a small way in some of my experiences, in that I've needed to conform to a certain understanding of binary complementary gender before being able to partake in certain aspects of the church, for example, Bible studies. So it was needed that you need to sign on to this framework, and then you can engage with Jesus. So, and then once you engage with Jesus, if you don't then conclude this framework of thinking, it means that you don't believe in Jesus. It's a weird kind of thing. And often we don't have an alternative to this orthodox doctrine, to explaining Jesus outside our own framework. The alternative often presented to us is individual liberalism, where anyone is allowed to believe whatever they want, and we end up with no shared consensus of what we believe in. But there must be a language that cuts through all of our differences and unifies us. If we are people that truly believe that the gospel speaks to people from all tribes and all nations, Jesus must amazingly and wondrously speak a language that all people of all time, with all types of life experience, can understand. God has been teaching me for the last few years, but very much so in the past 6 months, about the value of storytelling in Christian community. It was just before Christmas last year that Father John told us we need to do more dancing. I'm thinking we should accompany that with doing some more storytelling, particularly gospel storytelling. I've learnt this very recently from my Aboriginal siblings, and there's an article that has inspired some of my sermon today called The Resurrection of Story by Ray Aldred. We have access to the oldest storytellers in the world, so if we don't know how to do it, we don't have to go very far. I've also experienced the power of storytelling through the Godly Play training that Jodie and I did late last year. And the premise is to share Bible stories with our children and ask them what do they wonder about in the story. And it was so refreshing. We have a rich tradition of storytelling. There was Jewish storytelling, Jesus told stories, our gospel writers record stories. Sometimes stories have really clear punchlines, sometimes they're purposefully vague. They start a conversation. Stories cause us to reflect and wonder. Sometimes they don't provide a clear answer. We see in the gospel story this week, Jesus calling his first disciples, Simon Peter and James and John, sons of Zebedee. Paul's letter to the Corinthians in 15, our reading today, tells us how the story was passed down. From verse 3, Paul says, "For I handed on to you, as of first importance, what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And that he appeared firstly to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me." We see the story of the resurrection shared through the disciples. We see that Paul passes on that story to the Corinthians, and we have received this story today. The resurrection story is certainly foundational. This is the central story, and there are many stories which make up the story. Surely these are orthodox enough for us, to have these as our foundation, and not the doctrinal truths which we conclude from these stories? And is it also possible for us to communicate the fundamentals of our faith without using a system of words at all? Sometimes the most powerful ways of communicating are non-verbal. A few years ago, I did a trip to Nepal with World Vision, and we visited some of their community projects. It was called a Global One trip, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who supports them. We flew into Kathmandu, and then we flew over to the west side of Nepal to Dangadi, and then we drove up into the Himalayas, into some of these more remote areas of Nepal where there's not much connection. And it was incredible. One day's activity was just to hang out with a family who lived remotely in those mountains and who had some way connected in with World Vision or had benefited from their projects. Our group walked about an hour down the side of a mountain, which was beautiful. And we went through a few houses here and there until we arrived at the house of the family that we were hanging out with for the day. There was about 4 of us, including a Nepali English translator from World Vision. And some of the most special moments, even though we had this translator with us, were these really human moments that we had no way of verbally communicating with one another, but we could definitely communicate. The father of the household was giving us a tour of the farm, and he was showing us around the crops, showing us how he grows them, and he showed us to this ox. And he was obviously trying to show us that this is how the ox tills the crops. So he gets the yoke and he puts it on his back, and he's kind of like laughing and smiling, and then his family's laughing and smiling, and then we're laughing and smiling, and not a word had been spoken, or there had been words, but who would know what they were? And it was just this really lovely moment. They then shared this beautiful meal for us, and kind of like gave us more than them. We gave them a pack of cards, taught them how to play memory, where you've got to flip the 2 cards over and got to remember where the match ones are. And without speaking, this game turned into a game of Snap, where and the grandfather gets involved, and we're all kind of sitting on the dirt playing this game that's just evolving, and everyone's laughing. And this was honestly one of the most touching days of my life. It was so meaningful, and a lot of the experiences were not in words, and I can't express them in words. It was just being there with those people, sharing something really simply and truly human. Sometimes the most powerful ways of communicating are definitely non-verbal. Obviously, there are very intimate ways we communicate through touch as well. Greg told me this morning that the most powerful noise is silence. Our resurrection stories speak a universal language that often isn't through words. All of these stories describe God's actions towards all different types of people. It is God with us, God journeying alongside of us, sharing meals with us, responding to our illnesses with compassion. And sometimes we don't have clear words to describe these experiences, but we know there is something special about them. In the Gospel story from verse 4, when Jesus had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. And how does Simon Peter express in words what's just happened? Verse 7, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." They left everything and followed him. Simon Peter, I'm not sure, probably doesn't get everything at this point. He's overwhelmed. He kind of says, "Get away from me, Lord." And Jesus is like, "No, that's not the idea. I want you to come follow me." Peter can't voice exactly what's happening here. And yet this person here in front of him, he knows is worthy of being kneeled in front of. He knows that he respects him. He knows he can trust this person. And from that point on, he journeys with him. Jesus says this image of fish filling and sinking 2 boats describes the amount of people that together they will collect. And for those who are maybe a little bit confronted by the idea of being caught up in a net by Jesus with nowhere else to go, and the imagery of maybe being eventually put on a plate and eaten, I'm reassured by many commentaries that the phrase means to catch people alive, not to catch people dead. So hopefully that puts you at ease. But Jesus is building a community. The resurrection story is not just words, it is relationships. And we have seen that often the right words aren't there and don't need to be there. There are so many times that Jesus says something to the effect of, "Do you still not get it?" Often they don't fully intellectually understand everything. They can't explain everything. But all of these different types of people know that they can trust Jesus, respect Jesus, know they walk away afterwards in a better place than they were before. And they are drawn to be with him. They want to continue journeying with him. The resurrection story is about Jesus actively engaging a broad range of people and gathering them to journey together and create a community that draws others in numbers that will sink boats. And let's be real, there are so many different types of people there: slaves, women, demon-possessed, lepers. Brené Brown talks about two universal needs of humans everywhere: to be loved and to belong. Is this an idea about the universal language that Jesus speaks? We see that Paul has this same relationship with the church community in Corinth, reminding them of this group of people that they can trust and that they are part of. What they believe is not just about words. We belong to this community. We trust Luke and Paul, and that they wrote these things not just intellectually. I think we have some firm foundations of our faith. Paul says that I pass things on that were of first importance. I don't want you to hear me saying otherwise, that we don't have firm foundations, that we can't rely on some things to be real and meaningful and relevant. But I don't think we need to be restricted by defining them. Does it feel a little wild to suggest that our orthodoxy is simply our resurrection stories told in flourishing relationships with one another, in a way that we end up in a better place than we did the day before? Is that too loose? It's a little uncertain, a little humbling, to recognise that the way we communicate these stories to others may not be the exact same way that they explain them. And maybe when we use words, people won't actually understand. We cannot necessarily make assumptions or restrictions. We gather around these stories with a breadth of ways that God engages in our lives together, and we engage with each other. Jesus has a universal language that is more than just the verbal. Can I ask those who are confident and comfortable enough to tell me what their one word was that they used to describe the gospel at the start? Yep. Belief?
Just as a concise one word.
Yep. We had love. Liberation. Jesus. We had kingdom. Grace. For me, it's reconciliation. Jesus nailed it. Yep. In our church, we have all these ways of voicing what we believe the cross means most. Do we need to have the same words? Do we need people to see it in the exact same way that we do? How much does having the same words mean in comparison to what it means for us to show up here together each week as a community? To catch a train in and have a cocktail with someone after they take part in an intense Senate hearing throughout the week. An example from my week. I may have thrown things up in the air a bit in my reflections today, and with a sermon on how words cannot explain everything, I'm pretty sure maybe that's the point. However, I do want to bring that in just for a moment and say that I honestly believe that the answer to life is firmly found in the cross. And in the cross, it's actually not our own language or our own understanding that holds the power of the cross. Our faith doesn't unleash the power. The power is already there. It's the language of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that miraculously speaks universally, sometimes in ways that we cannot fully understand. The power is in Jesus and Jesus alone. And the cross holds us together in this community of relationships, journeying together to find a better place than we had yesterday. Food for thought. Amen.